Welcome to the Global Missions Podcast, a program for Christ followers who want to participate more effectively in God's work, both at home and to the ends of the earth. Visit us at globalmissionspodcast.com to find show notes, resources, and previous episodes, or to suggest a particular topic or guest you would like to hear featured on the program. You can also engage with us through Twitter and Facebook. We would love to hear from you. And now, here's your host, Rob Magwood, better known to his friends as Mags.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Global Missions Podcast. Today, we'll be discussing Business as Mission, or BAM, with Peter Shaukat. We'll be learning more about how business people across Canada and the United States can be more active participants in missions, using their business expertise through coaching, entrepreneurism, and other business-related activities. Before we get to the interview, we'd like to share with you this missions resource.
SIM Canada is convinced that no one should live and die without hearing God's good news. We believe that He has called us to make disciples in communities where He is least known. Visit our website at www.sim.ca to see how you can get involved. And now, here's today's interview.
Well, hi again, everyone. I'm pleased to welcome you to today's interview. Our guest is Peter Shaukat. And for those of you that haven't met Peter, he was born and raised in Toronto, Ontario. And since 1975, he has been engaged in cross-cultural mission, having lived and worked in a professional and business capacity on 6 different continents, including nearly 2 decades in South Asia. He is the founder and CEO of a global investment fund, which has invested in dozens of kingdom-focused companies across the Arab world and in Asia. Peter now travels extensively, teaching and mobilizing Christian businessmen and women to use their time and their talents and their treasure to extend the kingdom of God among the least served and the hardest to reach. Peter, welcome to the program.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you, Rob.
Just before we get to our main topic, I'd like to ask you, just share a bit about yourself and how you came to be passionate about God's mission.
I grew up in a Christian home, and mission was something that was very natural to the church where I grew up. And my family, my parents, very supportive of mission. In my late teen years, I kind of got away from the Lord and became really an idol worshiper, as I like to describe it, where my singular passion was football. And mission was something that other people did, and not me. But through a very, very serious football accident that took me about 1.5 years to learn to walk again, I came to really know the Lord, and literally within weeks of that experience and working through the initial bitterness and pain and questioning why God allowed that to happen, I really became deeply committed to the Lord and began to find a ravenous hunger for the Scriptures just taking root in my heart. And what began to develop, I think quite literally, as I turned almost every page of the Scriptures, I found that God was a God of the nations, and began to sense very, very deeply that He was calling me to be a world Christian. I was doing chemical engineering at the time, and at that point, there was this sort of sacred secular dichotomy that, ministry was a special calling for a special few, and that the role of, people like myself in engineering or business or whatever it might have been was to pay for others to do the ministry. So I really had this deep budding passion in my heart to follow Christ to the ends of the earth, which I knew he was calling me to do. I couldn't escape that from the Scriptures, couldn't escape that from part of my heritage that I had grown up to be familiar with, and so on. But how to incorporate that into my professional background was really the tough part. What actually ended up happening was my making a choice that was the only logical choice I could make at the time, and that was to actually set my engineering aside and follow Jesus in obedience into South Asia. and so it was a very interesting experience where the sacred secular paradigm that I was encountering continued in my own life. But it was that sense of calling to make Jesus known to the uttermost parts of the earth that really drove me. In retrospect, I see, that was really the Lord's grace, because I think one of the things that he was doing for me was actually putting me through some pretty interesting boot camp type experiences.
Hmm.
He certainly worked to kind of separate me from what I think would have probably destroyed me for the kingdom, and that was the extreme amounts of money that chemical engineers were making at the time. So this is like back in the mid 70s. And the Lord knows me and knows us better than we know ourselves. And so he took me through that. Even though it was a flawed paradigm, he was still in charge. And so the coming together of my faith and my vocation, that happened later. But the initial calling and leading into an obedience in that launching out cross-culturally, that had to happen and did happen in the way that God wisely understood.
Well, I appreciate your testimony of God's faithfulness. That tension that you described between the sacred and the secular is something I'm not sure we've got totally resolved, but I hope we're doing better at in these days, and that'll maybe be part of our discussion today as well. Back in this first season of the Global Missions Podcast, one of our most popular episodes was an interview with Larry Sharp, who introduced the basics of business as mission, or BAM, as it's sometimes called. For those that might want to listen back, it's globalmissionspodcast.com/003. And we want to pick up on this topic today. We want to focus on how the North American church and Christ followers in North America can engage in BAM. So, Peter, just as a refresher to our listeners, what is business as mission? What is BAM?
Yeah, I would begin, Rob, by saying I think that the term BAM is like, a language with many different dialects. You'll hear people refer to BAM or to business for transformation, and so on. I think that to a great extent they're very, very similar. I think as a basic working definition for business as mission, it really is authentic, credible commercial business. It passes, as I like to say, the smell test of what any business looks like. There's buying and selling. There's real goods and services being exchanged for monetary value. There are jobs being created. There are wages being paid. There are taxes being paid. There's hiring and maybe even firing. There's marketing. There's product development. There's supply chain. There's all of those things that any business person would recognize. And there's making money. The business has to be authentic. It has to pass the smell test. It's got to have all of the key commercial indicators that any business recognized as a business would have. But on the other hand, it must have, in the view of what I think is now a very widely dispersed global community of BAM practitioners, it needs to have genuine missional purpose and intent. It means, in my view, that the Lordship of Christ and the intentionality to demonstrate and proclaim and extend the kingdom of God must be not accidental to the BAM initiative, but it must be absolutely intentional.
Let me pose another few questions here to move our thinking on, Peter. Why should the North American church consider being part of or supporting a BAM initiative?
Yeah, a great question. I think fundamentally we always have to go back to the mandate of Jesus that, first of all, our engagement as Canadian Christians in the global mission enterprise is a mandate that's never been rescinded. It's based on a servant mentality that as Christians, we don't exist for ourselves, but we exist for the world for which Jesus died. And we need to think strategically, therefore, as Canadians, about how to, in the most meaningful and uh, effective way, engage in the fulfillment of that mandate. And I think that when we come to the concept of business as mission, what this is representing for the obedient Canadian church that is mission minded, period, because it's meant to be, it then turns the coin to say, okay, of all of the ways in which we can be involved, what are the ways that will enable us to liberate the talent, liberate the spiritual giftings, liberate the resources as a businessman, I think in terms of capital, liberate the capital in really meaningful ways. Rob, I would feel very, very badly if any conversation about business as mission led a Canadian Christian to conclude that it is the silver bullet, or that traditional approaches to mission are no longer relevant or needed. I think that is one of the most tragic misconceptions out there. And I say that as a global leader in the BAM movement. I say to my business colleagues all the time, please don't make our tough job tougher by suggesting that BAM is the way to go, is
Sure.
the strategy for the 21st century.
Yeah, and it complements, if I could say it that way, it complements some of the classical mission endeavors that are still valid.
Absolutely. One of the reasons why I think Canadians need to be involved in business as mission initiatives is because the gospel of Christ is, in its essential core, is a holistic message. And it's about the physical, it is about the spiritual, it's about the mental, it's about the emotional, and so on. The Gallup organization has pointed out and made a very, very provocative statement that the coming World War will be a war for jobs. And when we look across the face of the earth, there are, I mean, we're talking about at least a couple of billion jobs are needed. New jobs, formal jobs, paying jobs, jobs with dignity, and so on. And, you know, you can debate, is it 2 billion or 3? Is it 1 or 2? The point is that it's a lot. And it is uniquely business men and women who are gifted and talented to create those jobs through their entrepreneurial activity. And if we are, as Christians, going to be committed to the concept that the gospel is a holistic message and is relevant for the whole human person, then job creation, I think, is legitimate in the same way that taking care of people's medical needs or taking care of people's educational needs is legitimate. And what it means for us as Canadian Christians is that if we have in our churches business men and women of talent and resources that can be brought to bear to both solve practical problems and to be the image of God in some of these least reached countries. And that to me is a pretty compelling reason why the Canadian church should get involved in this. It's not because the other methods are not working. It's not because they're no longer needed. It's not because they cost more, cost less, or whatever. Those may be practical considerations, but I think at the core, it's an enduring missional mandate that's never been rescinded. It's from all nations to all nations all the time. We must see ourselves as servants of the human race. And then the business as mission piece is simply a practical example of how we can serve in our world in crisis in some very, very specific ways.
At times, I've used the analogy of a toolbox, realizing that for different types of jobs, different tools are going to be appropriate. The mission is still the same, but it depends which tool you're going to need out of the box. And in some cases, a more classical approach to mission may work, or in some cases, a tent-making approach may work, or in some cases, a BAM approach, and it depends, but it's all serving the same purpose, same mandate. Peter, let's think about the how question. For North American churches, some in Canada or the United States, if they want to begin participating in and supporting BAM initiatives, what advice do you have for them?
Well, one I would say very much is to begin with an audit of their own internal resources. Most churches are filled with men and women of business who are an unreached people group within their own church. They're not recognized as having something to bring to the missional table. And so I think that a church that is thinking about this could begin by saying, in our church, across multiple generations, who are the men and women who have or who are being called into careers of business? We very intentionally belabor that point, mobilize them, build community around them, and make sure they understand that the personal engagement in the missional task is an opportunity for them. Secondly, I think that the average Canadian church could benefit enormously from reaching out to some of the sending agencies who are explicitly advocating an involvement in business as mission. Now, not every mission agency that's talking about it can do it or is doing it, but do some research. These mission agencies are not out of reach. They're right down the street or whatever. Talk to them, engage with them, because what they bring to the table are some of the really critical insights around cross-cultural work, and a lot of business people don't know the first thing about that. They've got theological depth, they've got missiological understanding, and I think that's a very, very practical thing to engage in. I think also the church, to practically engage, needs to differentiate between business creators and business builders. And what I mean by that is that I think in the BAM movement, a lot of times we just talk about the entrepreneur, the person who's going to go out and start a business. And I think churches that want to engage in BAM should also be acutely aware of the fact that a lot of BAM initiatives already up and running are in desperate need of additional building resources. And so churches have men and women who may not see themselves or on critical analysis be perceived to be bona fide entrepreneurs, but they have enormously valuable business building skills. And to begin to send some of these potential assets into situations where they don't have to start it from ground zero, but they can help build it. That gives the church some small victories that it can celebrate, it can build its confidence from, and it can then begin to, ripple outwards and say, okay, like, what else can we do? What next?
I wonder if that would also provide some on-ramps for people that wouldn't necessarily take up a brand new thing, but they can join something that's already in motion.
Well, that's absolutely right. I mean, take franchising, for example. I mean, how do Tim Horton franchises work? Well, I mean, if you were going to go and start a completely new, coffee business, I wouldn't know the first thing about it. But given a toolbox of this is what you do, you actually are multiplying the entrepreneurial activity in a country's economy. And so there are lots and lots of ways. I think one thing that the church can also do is to be very intentional about recognizing the BAM ecosystem around it. What I mean by that BAM ecosystem is, where is business as mission being taught? We're sending our young people to theological colleges all the time. Well, what about sending some of our church members to BAM schools, to BAM conferences, or to academia, where BAM is now being taken up as fully fledged courses? I mean, it's being taught as a very, very serious discipline. There are other groups and events and so on that are forming this very holistic approach, multidisciplinary, and helping the church understand, in the same way that I just said, as a businessman, I don't have to do it all. No local church has to do it all. There's a supporting ecosystem that it can get plugged into.
Well, I wonder, along this line, if there is interest in participating in a BAM initiative, what are some of the challenges that a Christ follower in Canada or in the United States, what are some of the challenges that they can expect to face?
Well, I would begin by saying, differentiating again, am I a business creator? Am I the entrepreneur? Because the challenges there are going to be very, very different from the challenges that would face me if I'm going to contribute to an already existing business. If one is thinking entrepreneurially, then certainly the church and the individual needs to be aware of the very, very high risk of failure. In our advice, and I run an investment fund, so I see this all the time, I do not recommend that churches as entities get involved in the financing of BAM initiatives. But individuals within the church can be encouraged to come alongside of a new startup and get involved. That's a very, very different thing. That's the difference between individual money and, sort of corporate church money, as it were. That said, I think that the church, in contemplating the engagement as a sender and a participant in BAM, needs to be very realistic about the economic cost and prospects of that. Most BAM companies in most of the least reached countries of the world are not going to be in high-end economic zones. At the most, they may be what are called globally as middle income countries. And by middle income, we're talking about a per capita earning of maybe $5,000 a year. So what that means is, Rob, that you can have a very, very credible, pass the smell test business in a poor country that desperately needs the gospel. And the church needs to think through the very tough questions about how do we need to financially see this person resourced. Casting a BAMmer out on the waters to swim by herself and say, make all your money, cover all of your expenses, it's business after all, I think is thinking very, very naively. The church as a sending entity is still going to have to put its money where its mouth is. It will need to do it in different ways, in pragmatic ways, but it needs to understand that there are still many of the same predominant factors. There's the financial resourcing, there is the spiritual resourcing. The church as a sending body needs to be a praying body. And I think most would agree that the church that gives is also more likely to pray. The church that doesn't have any financial involvement generally, there are exceptions of course, is not engaged viscerally in that. One of the things I think that churches can do in engaging is rally the business owners in the church and say, okay, here's Jane Doe, or here's John Doe, who is being called by God. We're testing that calling. We do it the same way we do any other, person with their sense of calling. Is it real? That needs to be done. But then with business, there are some unique features, because what we're seeing a lot of times is a lot of so-called or wannabe BAM practitioners often have very limited business experience, or they may have business experience in large multinational corporates. And one of the things I'm seeing across the world is that the biggest domain for BAM is in the small, medium enterprise sector. It's not the silo multinational corporate mindset where you know everything about marketing, but you know nothing about selling. Or you know everything about human resourcing, but you know nothing about managing cash flow. And so what that means is that when the church can identify its small, medium business owners and say, look, we need to get these guys and gals as coaches alongside a potential goer, and they need to get, 2 years experience inside that company, being coached, being mentored, touching, tasting, feeling, pulling on all of the levers of the business, under close oversight, so that they really become familiar with what it looks like to actually run a business. That's an incredibly important part of this whole engagement process, in my view.
Wow. What a exciting and highly potential mode of ministry.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've seen this over and over again, not only in Canada, but around the world, that when the church at a very deep gut level understands its calling to serve the world, to see mission as its raison d'etre rather than just some sort of peripheral program in the church, that there is an enormous amount of potential unlocked, because you've got business people in your churches who are just rising to this challenge. I think the church also can be mobilizing these coaches to encourage these business men and women on the ground. You think of how many Canadian churches are sending short-term mission trip, people to places to, paint a fence, or to, put up a building, or to dig latrines or whatever. I mean, think of the potential of sending, a half dozen of your church's business folk to a half dozen countries over the course of a year, to come alongside a business practitioner for a couple of weeks and just sit with them, work through the details of their business with them, engage with them the other 350 days of the year by Skype and so on. I mean, this just brings mission within the reach of everyone.
That is a great vision. Peter, it's clear that we're just scratching the surface of an enormous topic here. If our listeners would like to learn more about BAM, what resources would you recommend for them to get started?
There are a couple that I would direct everyone's attention to. The website bamglobal.org and another website, businessasmission.com, are two, in my view, of the best sources out there, partly because they don't try and do it all. They're well linked to other resources. I mean, this is a socially capitalized movement as well, and it's not only intellectually rich, just the social networks that emerge from these sites can be very, very fulfilling.
Peter, if our listeners wanted to follow up with you and to learn more from you, how can they be in touch with you and keep learning?
Thanks, Rob, for that question. www.transformationalsme.org. There is a link to an email address there that would lead to my desk or to others on my global team that people could be in touch with.
Very good. Well, we want to thank you for spending this time with us and just unpacking a little bit more of the potential of asking missions-minded people who are serving in business to engage in global mission and not feeling that same secular, sacred division that we observed in your introduction. Thanks so much, Peter, for joining us today.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Rob.
Well, that's it for today's episode. We hope that you have been blessed. Remember that if you've been driving or riding while listening to the show today, or if you missed any of the links or resources, you can find those in the show notes on the website at globalmissionspodcast.com. And you can also talk to us through the website or through our Facebook page, as well as on Twitter. Your encouragement and suggestions are always welcome. The Global Missions Podcast is produced by the Jaffrey Center for Global Initiatives and Send International of Canada in collaboration with other like-minded agencies. On behalf of our entire team, thanks for listening, and we invite you to join us again in 2 weeks when we'll continue to explore this grand adventure of being Christ's witnesses to the ends of the earth.